How we doing, gang? Hey, happy Memorial Day. No, really, happy Memorial Day. How many of you are off tomorrow? How many of you are retired so you're like, I don't care? You're like, I don't care. Yeah, okay. Hey, glad to have you with us. Hey, if you're visiting with us for the first time, my name is Pastor Scott, and I am the teaching pastor. I'm just one of the pastors here at Waterbrook. And if you are coming in for the first time, or you're checking us out online for the first time, you're walking in kind of on the end of the movie, because we are finishing a series today called Family Matters. And I want to talk to you today about it is the most crucial component when we talk about the dynamics of families and when we talk about the dynamics of marriages and dealing with kids especially. So I want to get to that in just a minute, but I got something I want to use to lead up to it if I can. One of the things that happened when Lisa and I first met is when we first started dating is that I was already involved in ministry, and I was doing student ministry, meaning that we dealt with teenagers, we dealt with kids, middle schoolers and high schoolers. And then when I came to Waterbrook many moons ago, we were doing student ministry, and I was doing college student ministry then. And one of the things that started to happen is because we had so much interaction with students, we started having interaction with parents, which is kind of the norm. And we saw, and this was kind of neat, we were watching parents, and we were looking specifically intently at parents and how they did relationships with their children. And we saw some great examples during that time. And when we would see great examples, we would want to take them out to dinner, and we want to kind of pick their brains and stuff. And we also saw some not so great examples. Okay, let's just put it like that. And one of the things that started to happen is because I wanted to know how to be a good parent. We had a goal in mind. Lisa and I both came from marriages where we were both divorced before. We didn't have any children out of either one of those relationships, but we wanted to start a family, and so I was watching all the time. I was kind of watching some of the parents that I thought that were getting it right. And what I meant by that is this: we wanted to have a house, and we wanted to have a family, especially where our kids, when they got older, they wanted to come home. Now, not and bring the rest of their family, all right, to live. There wasn't that kind. But we wanted our kids, when they got older, we wanted them to come home. We wanted them to want to come home. And we wanted to, and this was the biggest part of it, we wanted to have a relationship with our children from the back seat all the way to the driver's seat. We wanted to be able to maintain that relationship with our children, okay, where our children would want to come home, because we had seen, like I said before, we had seen so many parents do it not necessarily the wrong way, but here's what would end up happening. And no parent does this on purpose. I mean, nobody does it on purpose. But they would end up in relationships where they had alienated their children, or where they had where they weren't talking to their kids, where they had damaged the relationship. And nobody does it intentionally. I mean, nobody does it intentionally. But we saw it happening. And so one of the things that we would do is we would find the parents that were kind of doing it right, and we would pick their brains. And most of them would say this: we don't know. We don't know how we do it. It's just kind of intuitive. It's just kind of, we just love our kids. We just, talk to our kids. I mean, it's just, they never could put their finger on it. I was wanting one of these A, B, C, kind of give me the 1, 2, give me the highlights of it so that we can emulate that. But they could never really put one certain thing that they did, or we could never really figure out one certain thing that these parents did. But we started to notice certain characteristics about their families, and we started to notice certain characteristics about their marriages, and specifically how their family units did some of these things. And one of these things, I'm going to talk about it here in just a minute, was the most effective thing that we saw that affected the dynamic of the relationships within every family. But these are just some of the characteristics of some of these families and some of these parents that we saw. These families had fewer rules. Now, this comes from the idea that In these families, what was happening was this. They learned to submit one to the other. Remember we talked about that the first week? Okay. All right. Remember we talked that the idea is that you submit one to the other out of reverence to Christ. That it's not reverence to anybody else, it's just reverence to Christ. And one of these things that these families did is they had fewer rules, meaning that most of the families that we saw that were more traditional, that were kind of having conflict with their kids, they had a lot of rules. And their kids ended up being grounded a lot. They ended up with their phones being taken a lot. They would get grounded and they couldn't even come to youth group. Right? And I thought, why would you stop them from coming to youth group? I'm delightful. You know what I'm saying? So I was like, but what would happen is they had all these rules, and these kids the ones that we saw, not all of them, but most of them, it seemed like these kids were constantly in trouble. They were constantly breaking the rules. They were these kids that were constantly pushing the envelope. They always wanted to push to see exactly how much they could get away from it, and it never really improved the relationships. Now, here's another one of these characteristics of this fewer rules was this. It wasn't that the family or the parents didn't have discipline. They did. They just didn't do it in conventional ways. They did it in ways that weren't necessarily what we would look at as conventional ways of discipline, but they had fewer rules. There was an underlining thing of family members somehow submitted one to the other. And again, it wasn't one certain thing that they did all the time. It was just how their family dynamics worked. The other thing, or a couple of other things, was this. They weren't afraid of their children. Now, if you don't have kids out here, you're probably thinking, well, who in the world would be afraid of their kids? I mean, who would be afraid of a toddler? Have you ever met one of those toddlers? Those things can be scary sometimes, but not you, sweetheart. You're a doll. But what happens is it wasn't necessarily that they were scared of their kids, but they were scared of the idea of what their kids may think if they rejected their children. If they disciplined their children, and again, they didn't discipline in conventional ways, but when they did discipline their children, they weren't afraid of their children becoming mad at them. They weren't afraid of their children rejecting them. They had this kind of poise about them that where they thought about this certain thing, we're still going to do things in this way, a certain way, and if you don't adhere to that, then you'll have to suffer the consequences. But they weren't afraid of their kids. Now, the other thing was this. They discovered what their children were into. Now, this may take me just a minute to unpack it, but it comes from this idea of trusting the process. We talked about trust last week. We talked about trust in relationships and how that dynamic has a tendency to work. But they discovered what their child was into. And the only way I can try to explain it is give you an example. There's like an athletic parent in the family, an athletic dad or an athletic mom, and what they'll have a tendency to do is sometimes push their children toward sports or push their children toward athletic things because they want their children to kind of emulate what they did. And if your children's into that, that's okay. But what they discovered was this. They let their children discover what their passions were, and then they kind of built things around that particular entity of their child. They let their children kind of discover what it was rather than force their children into areas or down avenues that their children didn't necessarily have a passion towards. They had a tendency to really focus in and discover what is it that makes you tick? What are you passionate about? What do you love? And then they let their children pursue that avenue. But keep in mind, this was another one that was really cool. They prioritized relationships over busyness. Not only were they not afraid of their kids, they weren't afraid of their kids missing out. And so many times, families get kind of caught in this cycle to where you run, And every one of your days are kind of mixed up, and they're just they go like, we got to run her to recitals. We have to run him to soccer practice. She has to go here. He has to go there. And all it is just this cycle of you just run and chasing your tail constantly, and you pass like ships in the night. You're like, hey, how you doing? They're like, hey, how you doing? Okay, grab a lunch, let's go. Shoom, and you're just shooting all around. And you're so busy that you don't get to work on the relationships that are developing in the family. But what these families had a tendency to do was to make the relationships between the wife and the husband and between the children, right? They made those a priority. They would do stuff like this: have daddy-daughter date nights, have father-son date nights or trips where they would go to the movie, where they would do something. Parents, especially, watch your marriage when it comes to your family. Take care of your marriage, because what happens is when you start having children, the care of the children can overtake the marriage, can it? And so they made it especially careful to prioritize the marriage in those two. Listen, you didn't become a family when you started having children. You were a family before then. You need to maintain that marriage because it's important when it comes to the dynamic of your family. But they prioritize relationships over busyness. They didn't get caught in that kind of cultural trap. And so one of the things that happened to them was that they had strong relationships, not only between the parents and the children, but also through the siblings, had strong relationships. And then this is one of the things they did, and this is where I want us to kind of pitch our tents today. They effectively communicated. They effectively communicated. Now, one of the things when we talk about communication and when we talk about the idea of effectively communicating, most people think if you were to sit down and ask them, are you a pretty good communicator? They would go, yeah, I'm pretty good at communicating. And what I have found out is this: most people aren't as good at communicating as they think they are. Right? Just because you like to talk a lot doesn't mean you're a great communicator. I have found that out personally. On a personal level, I have found that out. And one of the things that we start to see kind of take place right here when we talk about communication is this idea that if you want to have great family dynamics, if you want to have a great marriage, if you want to have a wonderful relationship with your children, to get them from the back seat to the driver's seat, to get them from the car seat to the driver's seat, and maintain that relationship through the formidable years, you have to be able to effectively communicate. Because this is what we know, right? One of the things we know is this: great relationships have great communication. Bad relationships suffer because of poor communication. Every single time. And listen, this happens a lot in families, but we also see it in other places too, don't we? We also see it in the workplace. We also see it with schools. We also see it in churches. We see it's a dynamic that it has far-reaching consequences across back and forth. And just because you may think you're good at communicating, it doesn't necessarily mean you are. The best example that I have for it is that I used to do premarital counseling. I don't do it anymore because I have a tendency to get them to fight more than I can get them to cooperate. And I found that out by mistake, is that there was this younger couple. I can talk about them because they don't go to our church. And no, they really don't go to our church. But I asked them, I'm going to tell you, this is how this happened. I asked them right after this incident that I'm getting ready to tell you about, I asked them if I could use this in a sermon. And they went, yeah, just change our names. And I went, okay. So I'm not even going to mention any names, but there was this younger couple that I was dealing with one time, and it was premarital counseling. And they came in, and I said, how are you guys' communication? We were talking about this very subject, and she jumps in and she says, oh, our communication is great. I mean, it is spectacular. I mean, we talk all the time. And he was looking at me, and he was doing this, which kind of told me that she talked all the time, but he never could get a word in edgewise. But she thought it was great communication. So I thought I would try a little experiment. So I said this. I said, all right, let's say one day, and I turned my focus and I was looking at her. I said, let's say one day you come home from work and she stops me in mid-sentence before I could even get finished. And she says, work? Work? What do you mean I'm coming home from work? And he says this, a man who hadn't said three words in 3 weeks decides now he's going to get some words in edgewise, right? And he says, oh, we're both going to be having jobs. Oh, we're both going to be having jobs. And she stops her focus of looking at me and gives him sole attention, which made me kind of happy. And she says, if you think I'm going to work after I have kids, you've lost your blanking mind. Now, I'm not going to tell you the words she said. All right, but beavers like to build these. And out west, if you go out to Las Vegas, there's a great big one out there in Nevada. It's called the Hoover. There you go. And then she said, you've lost your blanking mind. Well, at this particular point right here, I'm thinking to myself, I don't think they've effectively communicated about this. And I hadn't even gotten to my point yet. I hadn't even gotten to the point of my whole thing, and I had already made her mad. Now, I'm just going to tell you something. You may not believe this, but apparently I have a spiritual gift of human agitation. I don't know where it came from. I am so good at it, I can do it and not even try. That's how I know it's a spiritual gift. Right? Now, some people say it's from God. Other people will say it's from the devil. But neither they, it's a spiritual gift. Because I'm like, well, I'm going to have to press on through with this gal anyway because I want to get to my point and I'm not quite done yet. So I said, okay, so you pull in the driveway coming from somewhere. Okay? And she's like, she's already doing the bobbing of the head and the tapping of the foot. You know how that goes, ladies? It's like you're getting yourself wound up. You know, she's doing that. And I said, so you pull in the driveway from somewhere. And lo and behold, there is a brand new motorcycle sitting in the driveway. You're welcome. Hey man, I got you. Brand new motorcycle sitting in the driveway. And I said, and he's bought it without telling you anything. And she says, with the most dead-eye, cold steel Clint Eastwood response, he better not have. To which, once again, he decides to get another word in edgewise because I guess he feels like he's in a safe place or something. And he says, well, if you ain't working and making no money, I guess it's all mine to decide what happens with it anyway. Well, it went all downhill from there. It was like crash and burn. I never got him back on point. And it just goes to show, listen, sometimes when we talk about communication, we think we're doing a good job of it, but we're not necessarily doing a great job at it. Now, what happens is in the New Testament, there's a guy that comes along, and his name is James. And James is the half-brother of Jesus. Okay, now he's not always been a believer. As a matter of fact, James and his brothers and sisters, which are Jesus' half-brothers, if you look in Mark chapter 3, they think Jesus is crazy when he starts making claims that he's the Messiah. So James, his half-brother, he doesn't even believe that Jesus is the Messiah. But something happens to James when he meets a resurrected Jesus that then he starts to believe. He doesn't just become any believer. He becomes a disciple and eventually an apostle. And he ends up leading the church in Jerusalem. He becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And James, he's writing a letter to the church in Jerusalem. And when he starts off his letter, he starts talking about trials and tribulations. He starts talking about the hard times that we end up having because of just life in general, and also because we are now Christians. And James says stuff like this. He says, you ought to approach all the hard times you have in life with joy. And we're all like, did he really say that? I'm like, yeah, he said it. Go and read it. It's in James, the first chapter. But he talks about this dynamic of how trials and tests, they affect us as individuals. Then he goes into talking about how trials and tests affect us in our relationships. Because let's face it, rarely do trials and tests and hard times come to us in a vacuum when it doesn't involve people. Right? How many times have you had hard times or tests brought on you by somebody else? All right? Now, how many times have those been family members? Don't raise your hands. Especially if you're with them. Yeah, but the idea is that this is what happens to us, is that through the dealing of dealing with people all the time, we end up with these trials and we end up with these tribulations, and we can end up sometimes not just them bringing that into our lives, but it affects the dynamics of every single relationship. And here's what James gets around to telling us. Here's the overarching theme of what we're getting ready to look at. And he says, great communication doesn't just happen, it's an intentional skill set that's learned. Meaning this, most of us think that we're very good, or we do it very well at communicating. But we find out later that we're not quite as good as we thought we were. Now, I communicate for a living. And I'm here to tell you, I found out stuff about this in our marriage because I'm an extrovert. I know that may surprise some of you. All right? But it seems to me that here's what happens. There's extroverts seem to struggle sometimes with communicating. We can get our stuff out, but as far as bringing stuff in sometimes and listening really well, we don't do it as well as others. And so sometimes we have to work at it a little bit harder. But here's what I found too. This skill set, it's learned. And the people that do it well, they've either learned it because they've taken leadership courses, maybe at their jobs. They have had parents that emulated it very well, and so they ended up emulating it very well, or they have learned it through some series, okay, of either doing a lot of self-help or a lot of self-studies when it comes to themselves. Because great communication, it doesn't just happen. And James is getting ready to teach us something that is absolutely a game changer. And I know that's a gimmick statement that we use sometimes a lot, but it will. If you can do this, it will absolutely change your life. And men, let me talk to you just for a minute. There seems to be a part of every man that we struggle with communicating sometimes. Right? Okay, me and him apparently are the only ones in here that struggle with communicating. So Bob, me and you are going to get something out of this. All right. So, but the idea is that if we kind of lean into this a little bit, then James can teach us something that is absolutely key when we talk about communicating. Here's what James has to say. Dear brothers and sisters, that includes all of us. Take note of this. Everybody taking notes? You sure? Take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Now, I'm not going to get to the anger part this morning, but I think there's something neat to look at. The progression. James says if we're quick to do this and slow to do this, then it will make us slower to anger. So if we're better listeners and less talkers, we'll get angry less often. There's a natural progression there. But I want to talk about this, the quick to listen, more so than anything today. Well, this Greek word is a really cool word that James uses. It's the Greek word called tachos. T-A-C-H-E-O-O-S. Tachos. Now, it's where we get the English word tachometer from. Now, if you know anything, if you're a mechanic or if you're a gearhead, you know what a tachometer is, don't you? A tachometer is used to do what? To measure RPMs. That's right. That's revolutions per minute. That's for everybody else that's not a gearhead. That's the cool little dial right next to the speedometer. It goes like this. Right? What it does is it measures the revolution of the engine. And so the higher the RPMs, usually the faster you're going, right? But what James is saying right here, this is really cool. He uses this, tachyios is used in the verbiage of, and the word picture is this, that of a victor. Meaning an Olympian that has won a race because he or she was faster than everybody else. And that reminds us of the great words of the great theologian Ricky Bobby. When he said, if you ain't first, you're last. And all the Ricky Bobby fans said, shake and bake, right? Shake and bake, shake and bake. So but this is crucial because I think we miss this sometimes. Because here's what happens. We rush when we're in an argument with somebody, when we're in a heated discussion with our spouse or with one of our children, here's what we want to do. We want to be able to talk first, don't we? Because here's what we think. We think if I can get the first word in edgewise, the little litigator in me, that little lawyer in me that wants to use the intro, the 3 points, and the conclusion, that wants to use the PowerPoint, that wants to draw the red pens, that wants to say, and this, and this, and this, and this. And if I can talk first, it will be so brilliant, you'll have nothing to say. So it's usually a race, because this is human nature, isn't it? It's usually a race to see who can speak first rather than who can listen first. And James says this, you've actually got it backwards. It's the person that can win. The person who's quicker to listen is the person that will be the best communicator. Because here's what happens. We both want to be understood, don't we? Come on. When you're in an argument with your wife, when you're in an argument with your husband, you both want to be understood, don't you? And we both want to be heard. Now, we have a colloquial Southern term down here in the South. All right? And it goes like this. Hush up. Now, if you've ever had a Southern man or a Southern woman tell you to hush up, all they're politely telling you is this, shut up. They're just doing it in a really nice, cordial, meaningful way. But here's what we want to do. We want the other person to hush up and let us talk. We want the other person to say this, if you'll just be quiet and let me get my point across, I will prove to you why you're wrong. If you'll just hush up, I can get my 2 cents in, and then there'll be no more need for this argument. And the other person is thinking, no, I want you to hush up and let me get my point across. And so what happens is this, we just do this. We just bump heads, we just fight about it, don't we? Now, this is exactly what Jesus is talking about in the 6th chapter and in the 31st verse of Matthew when he says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You want them to be quiet so you can be understood. You want them to be quiet so you can be heard. And what James is saying is if that's what you want from them, then you need to give them the same thing you want from them. You need to give it back. Be the first one to listen. Because being an effective communicator means I have to be an excellent listener. Because this is what the question that this brings about right here. Why should I become a better listener? Well, the answer and the short answer is this. Because the healthier I become, the healthier my relationships will be. The better you get at listening, the better your marriage will be. The better you get at listening, the better father you'll be. The better you get at listening, the better mother you'll be. The better you get at listening, the better employee that you will be. The better brother you'll be. The better sister you'll be. The better friend you can be. Because here's what happens when it becomes this idea of talking with each other and when it becomes this idea of listening. And this is something, again, let me tell you, this is something I've had to learn. Because Lisa will tell you, I'm terrible at this. And I've had to work on it so much to get better at it. Because here's the biggest thing you and I need to understand. There is a big difference between hearing and listening. Amen. There is a big difference between hearing and listening. When Lisa Smith knows the TV's on and I'm watching sports of any kind, football, basketball, baseball, hockey, Tibetan midget wrestling, whatever the case may be, if you're talking to me and I'm going, yeah, oh yeah, okay, yeah, it's good, yeah. It's going, I'm hearing it, but I'm not listening to it, right? There's a distinct difference between hearing something and listening to something, because what happens to us, and this is what happens so much when we talk about the dynamics of relationships. You ever had this happen to your house? Your wife comes up to you, hey, honey, honey, yeah, we got to go meet with the Smiths at 6 for dinner. Look at that, babe, 4 likes. Yeah. And then later on, when you no-show the Smiths and your wife, your wife's like this. I told you we were going to have to meet the Smiths at 6 o'clock for dinner. And here's what we say. You never told me anything, because I was hearing it, but I wasn't listening to it. And this is what happened. Here's this dynamic, and this is where it really gets inflated. When we're at a disagreement with each other, when we're arguing with each other, we'll do this. We have a tendency to hear, but we don't have a tendency to listen. And here's what ends up happening. We're not listening to learn. We're just hearing to burn. And what I mean by that is this. You and your spouse are getting into it. And she's like, let me tell you something else about it. And you hear something and you're like, oh, I'm going to use that against her. Oh, and here, I can tell you if you do this or not. When you hear something in an argument and you focus on that and you're thinking more about your response to her than you are what she's continuing to say, then you're hearing to burn instead of listening to learn. When you're thinking, you're in an argument, and you've heard them say something, and it's triggered something, and you're like, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to open them up like a can of worms, and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say. I'm going to say it like this, and here's what I'm going to say it like this, and then I'm going to say it, and they're still talking, and you're thinking in yourself, oh man, I'm going to wipe them out. I'm going to burn them. Oh yeah, it's on like Donkey Kong. And you're just thinking all that through, and she's still talking. She's 15 more minutes of talking, and you've heard none of it. And you go, well, how about this? Because what happens is we end up not listening to learn, but hearing to burn. Now, I'm going to tell you where I'm seeing this a lot. And it really has, it has something to do with family. I see this a lot when it comes to politics. Social media and politics. And we won't listen to learn the other person's view. We're just hearing to burn. They're a Democrat. They're a Republican. And I'm not going to listen to them to learn. I'm just going to hear it to burn them. And we do it on social media all the time, don't we? And here's what's happening. It's starting to divide churches. Politics. When you and I die, God's not going to ask you if you're a Republican or a Democrat. I mean, you do know that, don't you? I mean, we do know that. And here's why it's so serious. If it's happening in the churches, I know it's happening in homes. I know it's happening in homes. To where a father won't speak to a son because one of them's a Democrat and the other one's a Republican. Or where a mother doesn't talk to a daughter, or siblings don't talk to siblings because they disagree about politics. And here's the thing about listening to learn, all right, and hearing to burn. This is what Solomon has to say about it. To answer before listening, that is folly and shame. Charles Spurgeon said it like this: if I speak into matters I know nothing of, I have engaged in foolishness, because one man can never know everything about another. Only Christ can do that. And so what happens is this: we're not listening to the other person. We're just hearing parts of it to burn them. And here's the thing about listening that I want us to get. When we choose to listen to somebody, this goes back to the very first sermon I preached in this series. What you're choosing to do is to submit to that person. This right here. When I choose to listen, I'm choosing to submit. And here's the first thing that we say. Here's human nature, because I know I used to say it to myself. Oh, no. I'm not listening to them. I'm not going to listen to them, because I'm going to tell you why I'm not going to listen. They're wrong. I mean, they're just wrong. Ask me. I'll tell you I'm right. I'll tell you, I'm not going to listen to them because I'm right. Now, here's the thing. How many times you thought you were right about something, and you found out later you weren't quite as right as you thought you were? You ever done that? Or is that just me? Where you thought you were dead to rights. You thought you had them right there in the crosshairs, and then to come find out when you get a little bit more information about the situation, or you found out that piece of information, or you found it out this, then you figured out, oh no, I was wrong. And we have a tendency to say, if I submit and just listen to them, that's me saying that I'm wrong, and I'm not going to do that. But here's the thing that we need to see, and I want you to see it for what it's worth. Listening to somebody costs you absolutely nothing. Nothing. You haven't lost an inch of ground by choosing to say, I'm going to listen to you. What you're saying is this: I'm just showing you a humble form of respect by listening to you. Because listen, it's not about talking at people. It's about talking with people. And when we choose to humbly submit to say, I want to listen to you because I want to try to understand where you're coming from. It doesn't mean that we're going to agree. It doesn't mean that you're going to get your way. But what it will do is it will do this. It will help our relationship to grow, because here's the fundamental thing that we need to see about this. Listening fuels acceptance. Listening fuels acceptance. When I choose to listen to you, when I choose to say, all right, we may not agree with this. I know that you're whatever you are politically, and you know whatever I am politically. And we may not agree with this, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to listen to you. What that does is it gives that person a feeling of acceptance. And I'm going to tell you something, since I've really started to try to work on my listening skills, I think I've gotten better, haven't I, honey? Thank you. Here's one thing I've noticed with my daughter. My daughter now will sometimes come to me and say, hey, Dad, can I ask you a question? Come on, man. As a daddy, it doesn't get any better than that. What my little girl is saying is this: I want your opinion in my life. I value your opinion enough that I want it. Will you interject into my life right now? Now, what parent doesn't want to hear that? What parent doesn't want to hear that? Now, here's the thing that really creams my corn about that sometimes, though. Sometimes when we're arguing, she argues like her mother. That means she's very good. It's exceptionally good, you know. And she'll use my own material against me. That really creams my corn when they use, listen, and I'm a preacher, so it's worse. You know, she'll say, well, you said in your sermon, and I'll be like, because I know she's right. But here's what she says sometimes to me, and most of the time she's right, and her mother says the same thing to me too. Dad, you're not listening. You're talking, but you're not listening to me. I want you to listen to me. Because here's the deal. Women, you testify to this or not. Sometimes you don't want your husband to fix your problem. You just want your husband to listen. Now, give your men a break, all right? Hey, man, come on. Yeah, I'm up here working for you guys. I'm swinging for the fences. Because men, now listen, we're fixers by nature. So that's going to be our go-to gear, okay? When you come to us a problem, you need to tell us, I don't need you to do anything. Don't go get your tools. Don't drive over there and talk to them. Don't set the record. Don't give me the 1, 2, 3 advice. Just listen. Why? Because listening fuels. And so many times communication's not about talking. It's about listening. It's about listening. Now listen, here's what this does. Listening fuels acceptance, and acceptance ignites influence. When your children start coming to you and going, hey, Dad, hey, Mom, can you answer a question for me? Or can you help me figure this out? That's what it's about, isn't it? I mean, that's what it's about, having that influence that they value. Because dads, let me tell you something, and you need to hear this, moms too. If they don't feel accepted by you, they'll find somebody where they will. Won't they? Because if every time they try to talk to you, you cut them off, you override them, you yell at them, you get mad at them, you don't sit and listen to them, then eventually they're going to say this: it's not worth talking to them because they shut me out. And if nobody's willing to, I'm just going to quit talking. And here's the thing that we need to see, because God put this in every single one of us. We're created for this. We're created as human beings for relationship, aren't we? We love acceptance, don't we? We gravitate to environments where we feel accepted. We gravitate to people where we feel accepted. And if parents, if we're not listening to our children, and children, if you're not listening to your parents, it works both ways, then we will always eventually find a place where we are accepted or where we feel accepted. That's why it's crucial. I'm telling you, this will change your relationships, because always when I'm listening, that influences everything. And acceptance ignites influence. Now, my last point right here. Listening promotes relationship. And rules without relationship will always lead to rebellion. Always lead to rebellion. We know this family. We know them pretty well. And they have a girl that goes to this private school. And this school is, I'm not going to talk bad about schools and stuff like that, but they have a tendency to lead from behind. And what I mean by that is that they're more reactive than they are proactive. They're big on a lot of rules. And they create all these rules constantly all the time, and it's usually into a reaction of something that somebody's did. And rather than just talking with them, they end up talking at them. And they create all these rules, and as soon as the teacher's backs are turned, the kids go buck wild. You want to know why? Because rules without relationship always lead to rebellion. In the Old Testament, that's the story, time and time and time again with the Israelites. God blesses them, God blesses them, God blesses them. They get rich, they get prosperous, they forget about God, they don't have a relationship with God, and they ultimately end up in rebellion towards God, and then God has to reel them back in. That's the story of the Old Testament, time and time again. And that will be the story in families if you have rules and you don't have relationships. It's okay to have rules, but you better have the dynamic of the relationship that comes in to play. I share this stuff with you because, listen, I'm not preaching at you from an ivory tower this morning. I'm coming at you as somebody that's the same person on a journey with you as well. That we're all trying to learn and become better at what we do. But the best way to be a great communicator, to effectively communicate within our families, is to effectively communicate with our children. And when we see this idea of relationship or the absence of relationship and how it leads to rebellion, that should be a red flag for some of us. Dads, how you doing at listening to your kids? Moms, how we doing listening? Kiddos, teenagers, if you learn this skill set now, it will save you some pain of what your parents have had to learn the hard way. Being an effective communicator means I'm a great listener. You've lost nothing by listening to the person across the table at you. Because listen, here's what I've learned. And Caleb and I love my son, but he was a lot like me. And we would butt heads a lot. And we would get into arguments sometimes. And here's what I figured out since he's died. Even if you win the fight, you hadn't really won. You didn't really win the fight. And if you always have to be right, then you're going to end up in the wrong. I would rather than be right, I would rather listen and make things right between my children rather than always argue with them and always have to be right. I would rather make things right with them. And rather than talking at them all the time, I wish I could come back now. I'd give anything and just have a conversation with my son. And talk with him and not at him. Let's pray. Father, in the precious name of Christ, thank you. Thank you that you have made us into relationship beings, that you have made us, Father. Want acceptance. I pray as parents, I know we get busy. I know we get caught up in our schedules, and I know life can just seem so hectic. But I pray that you would help us to slow down our speak. You would help us to slow down that speech, Father. That you would help us to run quickly, to be the first to listen, to be the first to seek understanding in our families, to lead our families, Father, by these examples. All for your glory and all for your name's sake, we pray. In the precious name of Jesus, amen. Hey guys, have a great Memorial Day. Listen, if you came in today and you need prayer, please don't leave here. And we've got prayer partners over here that will pray with you, okay? Have a great week.